For the purpose of the course, we'll use an open source boilerplate. It has been based off the official React Native Getting Started guide, and TypeScript integration is done using instructions from Microsoft's TypeScript React Native Starter repo on GitHub. Now, the default way of creating a new app in React Native is either using Expo or the React Native CLI. The boilerplate code is built using React Native CLI plus TypeScript integration and a few other tools that are required in any app. So let's look at what the boilerplate code has to offer. The routing and navigation has been done using React Native Navigation. We'll see more details of this in upcoming modules. For state management, we are following the Flux architecture. Flux really helps control the data flow of the application and manage it at scale. Redux is the library that implements this pattern, and we'll be using the same. We'll also integrate Thunk for side effect handling. The boilerplate code also has basic setup done for typography, some global styles for building elements and widgets. These will help in defining a design system for the app. And it also has code lint using Airbnb's linting. Now these tools can be replaced as per developer's choice. So next, let's look at the project structure before we jump into running the code. The project is based off React Native CLI. So the structure that we see here is actually quite similar to that. Now there are 4 major folders: Android, iOS, Shared, and SRC. Android and iOS are the native folders, while Shared and SRC are the folders that will work mostly on to build the React Native app. Now the native folders are only required if we want to make some changes to the native side, or if we want to run code from Android Studio or maybe from Xcode. Apart from that, in Android folder, we can find our APKs that we'll build. So it will be under Android, app, build, output, APK, and then debug. So we'll have the APKs here. So it'll be either a debug folder or a release folder based on the kind of app that we have built. These APKs are installable. We can drop them on simulators and install them, or we could also transfer them as files and then install them on our phones. So that's about the Android folder. For iOS, unfortunately, there's no such way to build files and then install them. They have to be done either through TestFlight or some other tool like Fastlane or maybe Firebase. Now, if you want to open the iOS project, remember to open the appname.xc workspace file. Do not open the appname.xcode project file. That will not work. So remember, you have to open the xc workspace file. We'll see how to run apps from the Android and iOS folder in the next lesson. The shared folder is where we have all the business logic of the application, and the SRC folder contains everything related to the presentation. In the shared folder, we have our Redux and our services. We look at Redux in detail in the state management lesson that we have in this course. The folders action, reducers, and store are actually a part of it. In action, we have all the actions of the app. We define all of them. App.ts has global actions for the app. As we keep building different screens like home screen or card screen or something else, we'll keep adding to it. The constants has all the constant types. We'll build objects to access strings. We'll never use hard-coded strings in the application. Reducers has index.txx. It combines all the reducers of the app at a single place for the store to consume. The app.tsx actually implements the action that we defined under actions, that is the splash launched. And similar to what we do for actions, we will also keep building different files for different reducers, and that we go forward as we go forward in the app. Store, this is where we actually initialize our store and we add all the middlewares. As you can see, we are actually adding the logger middleware and the thunk middleware. Yeah, it's there. We have added the logger inside an if block. Now this variable is exposed by React Native, and this code will only get executed in the dev mode. In the release mode, it's not executed. So it's a good place to add the logger, as we don't need the logger in production mode. Now finally, we pass the reducers and all the middlewares to it, to the store, to create the store, and we export it. So if we need any other middleware like analytics we may require, we can add them here. So thunks are basically action creators. They are great for side effect handling. Whenever a view fires an action, thunk is the place where we need to implement all the business logic. If we need to make an API call, if we need to store some data in application storage like async storage or SQLite, or something very simple like storing it in memory or fetching something, this is the place that we need to do it. Services folder is quite simple. We'll have all the different services here like analytics or making API call to the backend for card or for any part that your application requires. Now the core folder is what I like to maintain as a low level implementation. So we have storage.ts, and similarly we can have maybe an api.ts, and let's say that we want to use fetch for implementing APIs, or we want to use Axios or API source. Now this is where I would go ahead and make those implementations like for get calls, post calls and everything, and I'll expose very simple methods to the rest of the services. Now the reason for that is tomorrow, let's say we want to change from Axios to API source or to something else, or we want to change the storage from async storage to SQLite or again iCloud or something else. So this kind of abstraction really helps out for a long-term maintainability, as the services don't really care whether you're using what kind of technology are you using at the backend to make those calls really. Next, let's look at the SRC folder. So this one contains everything related to the presentation of the app, the screens, the views, the styles and everything else. Now config is basically the config that your application boots with. It can be all the APIs that your app will need to make calls to, the base URL, the default locale in case your app supports multiple locales. Then if a user has not selected locale up till now, then what's the default locale that's supposed to come. So basically this keeps growing as the app grows. Constants are again very similar to the action types we had. So all the screen names are basically strings, so we just try to define constants for those to be used across the app. In navigators, we have index.tsx. This is where the application boots from. It listens for a particular event. Now this is how it works in React Native. And then we can set some default options like do we want the top bar visible, and there are a lot of other things we can do. And then we tell the app how to boot the application with, as in do we want to boot with a stacked application, a single screen with a side menu, or do we want to use a tab navigation. Next is our navigation.tsx. So this is where we define the base navigation of the app, like the stacked app versus tab navigation. And then we have our router.tsx. So router.tsx has all the methods that we will call in response to user actions that are performed in our applications. So for clarity, I just like to separate them out as navigations and routers. As we can see, router would be let's say show cart screen or maybe show modal or something like that, or maybe go back to some screen, right? Or pop to root. Pop to root is basically if we have opened 4 or 5 different screens, then going back to the base screen. So router is basically more towards routing logic. Next, let's look at the view folder. So this one has assets, elements, screens, styles and widgets. So assets are all the SVGs and PNGs that we are going to use across the application. Screens are all the different views that we will have. Styles is where we'll define the global typography of the application. Now global.tsx is the global. We'll talk about building a design system in the application, which really helps in maintainability and consistency of the app. Now global.tsx and typography, these two play a very critical part in building that. So globals has default settings for some of the styling of the app, like what should be the page margin, what should be the header size, what should be the title size, what should be the button fonts, colors, and these types of things. Typography is our application's let's say color palette. We can call it color palette or theme. So it has a few things like colors, fonts. So we define the colors over here. Like I said, we don't want uh, 10 developers to be putting in 5 different blues in the applications. A blue that is our brand color. Will simply declare them here and reuse them across the application. So this will work as a typography. And we'll also declare the fonts over here. So let's say tomorrow we want to change the font from Helvetica to something else, to sans serif or Comic Sans. All we need to do is we need to come and make the changes over here, and it should reflect throughout the entire application. Now I left the elements part on purpose as uh, it plays a critical role in building the design system. The elements and the widgets, we'll look at them in detail in our design system lesson, but in short, elements would be our most native building blocks of the application, like buttons and text boxes. We'll also style them using the typography and the global styles that we have defined, so that we can really build consistent components across the application. Widgets will be our components. So these will be like headers, like carousels, product widgets, and all the different components that will be required to build any particular view or screen on the application. That was the structure of the application. Next, let's look at the flow of code. So index.js is the entry point of the application. It's calling an app function which is inside our navigator. Now our navigator is listening for a registered app launch event, and once that is done, it will set some default options like about the top bar. Do we want it to be visible or not? What theme should it be? And then it sets the kind of application we're looking to build. So this show splash method over here, it's trying to do a stacked app with a side menu. Now if we wanted to do a tab navigation, we have already defined that here. All we needed to do was call that particular method instead of the show splash method, and our application will boot up with a tab navigation. Now, apart from that, we are registering all the screens over here before the app launches. So if we build a new screen, they have to be registered over here. And we have written a very thin wrapper, since we are using Redux as state management, and all it does is it adds the provider. This is very similar to what we do in Redux, and it passes the store to those screens. Now once the app is launched and the control is moved to, let's say, the splash method over here, it basically calls the splash screen. Let's go there, and it tries to render the splash component that we have over here. So let's look at any particular screen. This is basically broken into 3 parts. One is the component.tsx. So this is basically the entire component that we define. It can be a class, it can be a functional component. Next is an index.tsx. We are defining our map state to props and map dispatch to props over here. It's very similar to React. So basically what a map state to props does is we would use it to provide the store data to our components, like the splash page over here, splash screen over here, whereas the map dispatch to props is something that we will use to provide action creators. So any actions that we dispatch will be declared over here, and from here we'll call the methods from the thunks that we had defined earlier. And the next is styles.txx. This is again very simple. It contains all the styles for a particular screen. Now we saw a styles folder earlier. Just remember the difference, that the folder that we saw earlier, which had global and typography, are styles that will be reused across the application, and they should be referenced like over here as much as possible, but we will need styles for individual screens, and it's best to keep them along with the screens. It's just easier in development mode to have the styles along with the screens while we're building them, but you can definitely choose to keep all the styles together. So that's the entire flow of the app, and it has all the basics that are required for building an app using React Native, and it also has TypeScript. So it doesn't have anything additional As of now, only React Native navigation. So if we'll go to the package.json and we'll look at dependencies, so it only has Redux for state management, and it has React Native navigation. Apart from that, the package.json has a few scripts that are helpful. Like we have the command for building the Android app in debug mode or in release mode, or we want to start the Android through our terminal. So we just need to do React Native run Android, the variant over here, and this is the device ID that the emulator, the ID of the emulator that needs to be in your system. Just change it and use what you have in your system. And very similarly for iOS.